Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. While we're waiting to get started, if you want to say hello in the chat box, let us know where you're joining us from. Once again, hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in just a minute. See a good group here. Iowa, Missouri, New York, Massachusetts, Texas, any West Coast folks? California, there we go. Georgia and Oklahoma. Right, Pennsylvania, more Colorado and California. Great. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a couple housekeeping notes. All attendees are in listen-only mode. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording and the slides will be made available to you. Welcome again. My name is Leslie Gabay-Swanston. I'm the Director of Program and Systems Quality at the National Summer Learning Association. Before we get started, here's an overview of our discussion today. First, I'll share a little bit about NSLA, and then we'll hear from our featured guest, Dr. Noam, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers from you, and then a few announcements to wrap up. As we're going along, if you have any questions that you want asked and answered live, please put those into the Q&A box. I'll try to catch them if they're in the chat, but if you want to make sure that we see them, please put those into the Q&A box. So a little bit about NSLA for those of you who are unfamiliar. The National Summer Learning Association is the only national nonprofit exclusively focused on addressing the achievement and opportunity gaps. We do this, we're looking at increasing access to summer learning opportunities. NSLA's goal is to increase nationwide the number of high quality summer learning programs. To achieve this goal, NSLA recognizes and disseminates what works, offers expertise and support for programs and communities, and advocates for summer learning as a solution for equity and excellence in education. NSLA's work is driven by the belief that all children and youth deserve high quality summer learning experiences that will help them succeed in college, career, and life. Core to our work is the recognition that high quality summer learning programs work and have been shown to improve reading and math skills, school attachment, motivation, and relationships with adults and peers. So before we hear from Gil Noam, I want to introduce Aaron Dworkin, CEO of NSLA. Aaron?
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. And we're really excited to hear from Dr. Gil Noam, a great partner and mentor and friend to our organization, to our field, to me personally. I just want to share what an exciting and real moment this is for the summer learning community and how relevant and helpful Dr. Noam's book will be for all of us to learn from. If people haven't been following with the new COVID emergency federal funding bill that's about to be signed into law in the next day or two, there will be an additional, there'll be lots of money, but there specifically will be about $1.26 billion for summer learning programs to be spent in the next couple summers. That's in addition to another $1.2 billion for funding specifically for after school programs. And this is all in response to COVID and what we're all experiencing. And social emotional learning and programs that focus on those elements are going to be much more in demand than ever, and how to do it well will be very key to all of us in helping our young people in our programs. So we're very fortunate to have Gil join us today. Many of you hopefully know about Gil, but he's a professor at the Harvard Medical School and faculty member. Actually has been, I met him at the Harvard Education School, but he's illustrious. He's a long career focused on supporting the out of school time field, written so many different publications, including his new book, Big Bets, 10 Big Bets, which we're going to hear about. And also he's been the founder and chair of PAIR, the Partnerships in Education and Resilience. And just, we're very fortunate that he has taken this time during COVID to write a book that will help inform what we could do better and improve our practice in helping young people during this time. So no further ado, Gil.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Leslie, for giving me the opportunity. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to share the screen. Welcome to everyone. While I do that, let's see here. Share. Okay. Perfect. Let me just test. Yes. Okay. So unfortunately, I can't see you all, or I can't see anyone really, except Leslie and Aaron and Elaine, who helped me with this work from the beginning. Elaine Ling Y. Zhao. So what I'm going to do is give you a short synopsis of the book, but I want to first kind of organize it so we really figure out what is the moment and why did I actually write this. This is the first time I'm actually talking about the book to a public audience because it just came out very recently. So if it's a little rusty, or the opposite of rust, I guess, it wouldn't have time to be rusty, but a little new, I mean, let me know because I'm still learning how to do this. But I want to begin with a quote that comes from the book, which is that every day of the curriculum and every hour of work should include students engaging intellectually through why questions. Why? Pursuing curiosity, taking pride in mastery, and having permission to learn from mistakes. So if we get this $1.6 billion into the field of summer, we have an incredible opportunity to experiment. And there's no better space, I think, than the summer when people are less pressured and when they can really actually allow young people to explore their passions and at the same time provide them with skills and let them have voice. And that could become, I think, and Aaron is working and his team are working hard on this, that could become really a very strong bridge to schools. The book deals a lot with schools because I think that's where we have to transform things radically. But before going there, I want to go on and just give you a little bit of a sense. Let's see. Okay. So just to remind us where we are in the world, because it's very confusing. I just had a discussion this morning with a friend at City with whom we work very closely. And we really were saying a lot of work has gone into people adapting to the pandemic, and that was super hard. Now we have to get people ready, and ourselves, we have to actually adapt to a whole new world, which is hopefully the end of the pandemic as we know it, but that's also a big adaptational job. So nearly a quarter of Boston Public High School students were during the pandemic not logging into classes daily as course failures rise and rised. I mean, just know, I mean, 1 year, it's been 1 year, probably even today, I remember staying home and thinking maybe for a few weeks, maybe for a month, but that was exactly a year ago that I think all of us started staying at home, and many of us have not returned. As schools go remote, there's a finding of lost students, and it's harder and harder to connect with them. So now we are opening schools, and that's a big deal, a very big deal. And the question that I raise also in the book is, well, what does it mean to open schools? Are we just going to go back to what we know, or do we have to go to something very different? And you know my answer already without my saying a word, that obviously I don't think we should or could, even if we wanted to, go back to what it was like before the pandemic. Why? Here, I'll show you a couple of slides that are also in the book itself. These are average reading scores, 13-year-olds from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP. And you have a comparison here of white students and Black students over the course of since 1992 to 2019. So that corresponds with the time of No Child Left Behind. And I remind you that during that time, billions and billions of dollars were spent on accountability testing and evening out the curriculum. And what do you see here? And we have other statistics that go back to the 1970s. It is what my colleague Paul Revel calls a resilient statistic. And what's meant here with resilient is it's not changing. And it hasn't changed despite all the investments very much. On average, reading skills have remained the same. 250 for white students is not bad, but it's not good either. African American students at the same time have increased a little bit up until 2017, very little, it's gone down, and the gap has remained the same. Another resilient statistic, but a demoralizing one. What is going on? Why is this not changing? And you can see that the students, the Black students, are hovering just at the average appropriate level, going up a little bit beyond it, but really not good enough. It's really a disgrace. Now, if you look at math scores, same thing. Look at the discrepancy and also see the slope. Practically no change, very, very little change. A little better than for reading. And this is now from 1978 to 2012, because there are two waves that are being compared, but it's really very much the same. Now, if we continue to look into the racial disparities, now during the pandemic, you will have read a lot about the fact that white students are suffering less learning loss than African American or Latino or students of color. And so this shows that the Black is students that have more than 50% students of color, and the blue dot is students who have more than 50% white students. And you see how much loss there is. This is the percentage from the historical scores during 2019 and 2020. So everyone is losing. And in certain areas, really a lot. I mean, math, fifth grade math, you can see that white students are only 53% of their historical scores, but 37% of African American children. So that, shows you the discrepancies and the injustices and the inequalities in learning and learning gain. And again, I want to bring it to the summer learning, because this summer is going to be critical to support students, not to catch up. I don't think our job should be to make their lives miserable and just cram, but to really take count of the fact that summer learning loss is compounded with really loss of an entire year. So next, I want to just show you two more things and then go to the solutions. When you get to the mental health side of things are quite bad. And it's really important to recognize this. We did, and Elaine was very much involved in that, an analysis of many different issues that come up for students during crisis, like the pandemic in 1919 or 18, Katrina, the Great Depression, the Great Recession, I mean, all of that. And I've presented some of that to you, whoever was there then, in a talk for the organization. We had a webinar about that. So now we have data coming in, not just planning on figuring out what's going on, but really knowing what's going on. And what you have is the proportion of children's mental health related to emergency department visits increased and remained elevated through October. Compared with 2019, the proportion of mental health related visits for children aged 5 to 11 and 12 to 17 increased approximately 24 to 31% respectively, which is exactly what we predicted, that it would be around 25 to 30% increases. That also means that these increases exist in your programs in the summer. So as you plan, you have to deal with that. And it's not going to be over because the pandemic might be better. It is going to be lasting effects that have to be treated over quite some time. The study reveals that parent psychological well-being worsened as well. The more coronavirus disease and 2019 related hardships that family experienced, the worse parents' and children's psychological well-being. There's a direct correlation. Shouldn't surprise us. We now have the data. So what we do and what the book actually is strongly based on is we call a kind of North Star of wellness and thriving and learning, kind of the open mind of the child. What is that? So rather than kind of just adding to the literature of gloom and doom, and there certainly is enough to go around for a long time, I think we would like to kind of think about this as, so what is the North Star? What is a good summer program? What is a good school that actually creates wellness and thriving and ability to really open one's mind to learning? And so we have these 4 quadrants that we found through the literature, and they are kind of connected also to other models, so it's not the only model around. One is active engagement, which is kind of body, physical, impulse control, emotion regulation. Second one is assertiveness, which is voice, choice. Third one is belonging, a young person who has relationships, can trust, can evolve over time with the support of others. And finally, reflection, which is meaning making and an ability to have optimism and look into the future. Well, if you now take that into the pandemic, which I do in the book, then actually the hardship is very much also organizable in relationship to the thriving, the model of thriving, which is that students and adults lacked physical activity at home. There was no sports. Maybe students got more sleep than usual, very possible. So that's a plus potentially. But in terms of really feeling one's body, being out there, it was pretty dire. Loss of voice and choice in virtual environments. It was very hard for teachers to do this anyway. And it was equally hard to then provide students with their own voice under those circumstances. Belonging, the relationships were just really tough. And wherever students and teachers had good relationships before the pandemic, they could use that momentum. But unfortunately, in many school districts, it showed up that really the relationships were not so strong and they couldn't withstand very well the virtual aspect of the learning. And finally, reflection, meaning making. The anxiety made it very hard to have a future orientation during the pandemic. Everyone was paralyzed. As we know, people were fighting, adults were fighting, people didn't know how to use science. There was a lot of kind of complexity, and that really rubbed off on children and youth. So that's kind of the background that I wanted to provide you. So what do we do with this now? Why is this really important to understand? I think it's important to understand, and I will make some controversial statements, that the pandemic really exposed the crisis in education. I think despite everyone's attempts, and despite the fact that many, many people really tried their hardest, it didn't work well. I say it again, it really did not work well. This year has been really a difficult moment for American education, for world education. I sit on a couple of these kind of international panels. I mean, everyone was struggling. And this is really not about finger pointing, but it is interesting, not only that we were totally unprepared, really entirely unprepared, despite the fact that people knew this could happen one day. Schools did not have a plan B. So that was hard. That was the first few months that people had to adjust. But then what happened after that was not really, in most cases, very engaged learning just with another platform. And I think that what this exposes is that we cannot continue to do education the way we have. We just can't. It is really a moment where everything came to a halt. And similar to transportation, sure, we can all jump on planes again, in a few months and say, hey, let's party. But we will have missed an incredible opportunity to ask ourselves, do we really have to go? And Aaron, I'm sorry if I say this, I do think people should come to your conference, but in a broader way, do we really have to go to all these conferences everywhere? Do we have to be on the plane? I was on the plane probably every 2 weeks, at least. Was it really necessary? I mean, now that there are norms that we can actually do a lot of business on Zoom, shouldn't we really return in a different way? And I think that will be the question for every area if we use this crisis well. And I really have written this book from the perspective of let's not waste a crisis. I mean, you've heard this now enough times and it's kind of like a cliche, but it is true. And the fact is that it wasn't so great before the pandemic. And I don't mean every school in this country. There are exceptions. And, independent schools can do more experimenting and are often more relational. Urban schools have to deal with a lot of stress and trauma in their communities. So that is hard. So I'm not making it an easy thing, but I am saying enough is enough. It really doesn't work. And let's not tinker. This is not a time to tinker anymore. And I'm not the only one who's saying this. There are many people and more people, and I think especially in the out of school time field, that have said this forever. We need to have stronger relationships. We need to connect with the students differently. We need to have engagement. All those things, in a certain way, what we're saying is what we have developed over the last 20 years in the out of school time is now ready for prime time in changing schools the way we know schooling. And that's a hard one because we are in the periphery and we're now claiming kind of the more central part. So the book is really organized around 10 big ideas. And the 10 big ideas, now you've seen this slide for a long time while I was talking, the 10 big ideas are very psychologically oriented. So I'm not really talking as much about what should one do around the curriculum, but there are some transformational elements here that are essential. One is optimism and hope. Without that, nothing will work. And it's very hard to do this at the moment when there is so much hardship. The second one is engaged learning, the second chapter. What does that really mean? And how can we not have engaged learning? But we don't in many classes around the country. How do we get there? Third one is relationships. I will get back to that topic. Fourth one is structure and norms. Fifth one is rituals, especially at a time like this. Sixth one is educators. Who are they? What supports do they need? Let's not ask them to do more. Let's ask them to pivot. That's a different issue than, hey, do this in addition, do SEL in addition to everything you do anyway. Next one is mental health, essential during our times, but also before the pandemic. There was more and more interest in it, more and more need for it, but the system is very fragmented. Then the issue of community, which includes after school and out of school time, parents, that schools can't do it alone. What does that mean? The ninth issue is processing. Now that students are coming back, what are we doing with the history of the last year? How do we help them process? Is that the role of schools and after school programs to process, or should that be done just in the family? I mean, these are rhetorical questions because I do think one should process, but I also think one should be very careful not to get too much into the trauma of things. And the last one, that ties back to optimism and hope is the courage to change. What does it take? Why are we so afraid of fundamental change? What does it take? And how can we use this moment to really be much more courageous than I think we typically would be? And, it raises also the question during a crisis, can you ask for all these things? Or is it really just enough for people to just open schools again and do what they know best and not really ask for transformation? And that's a big question, which we can discuss later. So in each chapter, I come up with very practical topics. So it's really a book that is quite far-reaching and big ideas, but I do want to bring this to educators who actually have to be in a classroom or in a after-school summer program the next day. And so this is one example. I mean, so around the issue of optimism, I say, be honest. Things are not going to be perfect or even good all the time. There is, can't see this. There's a time for optimism and a time for candor. Know the difference and give your students some credit. They can see through inauthentic attempts at positivity. Take more negative moments as opportunities to strengthen your students' resiliency. So it doesn't go quite to the level of, this is exactly what you should say, because I don't believe in that. But you can see it really does provide a framework that is practical in how you should frame this. And we have developed, and I'm continuing to develop, discussion guides so that teams can actually read a chapter. They don't have to read the whole book, and then start discussing this around like very concrete ideas. Okay. So I want to get to 5 central themes of the book. Even though there are 10 chapters, there are really a few themes that cut across the book. And I want to really talk about and read you a couple of segments so that you get a sense of the voice. So let's start with relationships. Let me start, instead of starting with theory and research, let me just read you a short paragraph. So this part I make very personal, actually. And not the whole book isn't autobiographical, but I do try to talk some about my own experiences and make it personal. When I think back to my many years in school, from kindergarten to high school, to undergraduate, to PhD, to postdoctoral training, I mean, I was in schools many years. This is a commentary. There are a few people who stand out. They were the teachers who reached me, were able to mentor me, in whom I looked up to. Many other teachers mattered as well, competent ones who helped me gain insights and skills. But they're very vague in my memory. They did not open my mind because they could not relate to me as a person, push my thinking, and influence my identity development. I'm sure they knew a part of me, but they did not show commitment and true interests. But those few that do stand out in my mind are pillars of my development, giants on a personal level. I'll describe two types of teachers I encountered. There was my elementary school teacher, who was not a cuddly, warm type, but a man with keen observation skills with a firm and loving way with his students. He provided structure and a way to convey that he knew me well, along with the other 40 students in our classroom. This was in Germany. He believed in something in himself and in us, and that translated into knowing me. Instead of grades, we received detailed notes that showed the level of understanding and care that made me feel safe. The second group of teachers I had in middle school were young, energetic, and competent. This was, by that time, we had moved to yet another country, to Switzerland. But they were too busy living their lives, and they did not reach me in any meaningful way. They worked, I worked, and together we had pretty good outcomes. But in the process, I felt entirely isolated from them emotionally and only looked up to them in an abstract way. When one teacher stepped back on a mountain tour, taking a picture of his colleagues, he fell 5,000 feet to his death. There was shock, disbelief, and loss when we learned about his death. But even the mourning remained very unemotional and distant from me. This juxtaposition of two types of relationships have stayed with me. One created depth, warmth, and soul. The other created skills and competency without dynamism. I've come to the strong conviction that what matters in the long run is the combination of the two. That is what makes it all stick and what makes us passionately educated, ethical, and competent human beings. So I actually had fun to write this because I first was really more abstracted. And then I said, well, I should really talk to my audience more honestly and directly. But what this really means is a stance of relationship that just has to become part and parcel of the educational system. And as you can see here, I'm not saying every teacher should have a really powerful, deep relationship with every student. That would be great, but that's probably not what's going to happen. But two things need to happen. We, in my team, have this mantra, which is knowing every child. We have to have the collective aspiration that there is no child in our program, no child in our classroom that is not known. They all have to be known. They don't have to be known by everyone at the same level, but they have to feel they matter, we are interested in them, and we are on their side. We are not primarily taskmasters or task mistresses trying to make them do something. Yes, we do have to have structure and we do have to have high expectations, but at the foundation, at the basic foundation, are human relationships. If they are not intact, then we are not going to gain traction. And my belief is, my strong belief is, that the reason why we don't see a change, why these statistics are so resilient in the negative way, is because the students are alienated. We don't get to them. We don't get under their skin. They don't learn for us. They learn for some abstract way of learning. It works better in elementary school in our schools in the United States. It works pretty badly in the middle school time. And in high school, it can regain, but often the high schools are so big, it's really hard for students to find their place. So what does that mean? From psychotherapy, by the way, Leslie, if you can just tell me, or maybe I can do it myself. I mean, what time it is? I just want to leave enough time for discussion.
1:36.
Okay, yeah, I see it now. I set it up. Thank you. Having strong relationships is really an art form. It's really as complicated as, you know, cooking really well. I started cooking a lot during the pandemic. So I've learned to respect what it takes to really cook an excellent meal. And you make a lot of mistakes and you have to then start again and you have to learn from your mistakes. I mean, relationship building, it's not just about, hey, I want to have a relationship with you. Some people are just lucky enough that they are just like natural in how to build relationships. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in the out of school time field and in the summer learning environments. But, you know, what I'm talking about is how much time is spent by human beings misunderstanding each other, becoming defensive, feeling attacked when it's not meant as an attack. I do couples therapy and family therapy, and you know, that's my part of my bread and butter, to see how people who love each other really misunderstand each other and really get more and more kind of entrenched, and how much help they need to get out of this. This is also true for educators and their students. There's just, when humans are together, that's the problem. The problem is that we are all complicated beings. So to figure out how to actually support educators to have the best relationships possible is a very big endeavor. And that's, I think, what has to happen now. We are at a place where everyone has suffered, and human suffering can create solidarity. And I think there is an opportunity, an immense opportunity right now for students to come back right as we speak or in April, and to feel that their teachers have also suffered, that everyone went through hardship one way or the other. And that is bonding. That can really be bonding. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why in the mental health field, when, you know, there are really horrible things that happen, like for example, London, the attack of the Nazis and the nightly raids, bombing raids, they did not create a terrible outcome for the students, even though for the children, even though they were very scared. What created the bad outcome was when they were sent away for safety reasons into the countryside, away from their parents. That's when they really suffered. When they were close to their caregivers, they suffered much less, even though they were in greater danger. Think about that. And I write about this. That's a very important statement. So in other words, the students are coming back to their teachers and they now understand that they missed schools, they missed their peers, and now they're back and can actually create different relationships. The big issue is, will we as institutions allow for these relationships to happen? Because if we don't model that in the relationship between adults, it is going to be very hard for adults who feel alienated from their colleagues or from their schools or from their after-school program to really be relational. And I mean here a radical relational orientation. I have seen it work in the mental health field, where for a long time, people were actually shying away from strong relationships. They didn't want to interfere too much in the patient's, you know, ruminations and associations, which led to all these, you know, wonderful cartoons in the New Yorker about the silent analyst behind the couch. That got blown out of the water by a man named Kohut in Chicago, who said the essential part of what we have to offer is an empathic relationship with a suffering person who is trying to work out their lives. And I can't tell you how many treatments changed. It wasn't just because of him, it was also the zeitgeist. But once therapists were freed to create strong relationships with their clients, which is kind of paradox. I mean, how can you not have that? But it isn't a given. Once they were able to do that, things changed dramatically for patients, for therapists, for everyone. And I think we need that same paradigm shift in schools, which leads to one last issue around relationships, namely that it is wrong to think about relationships as being empathic, nice, friendly, supportive. That's only a piece of it. The other piece, the paradox in all this, is that when you have a strong relationship, and just think about your own children, it's the same thing. When you have a strong, loving relationship, and I mean loving, it's okay for teachers to be loving and educators towards the children they work with. When they have that foundation, they can push those children in ways that they could never do otherwise because the resentment would be so high. They can say, look, I'm right here with you, and I want us, not just you, I want us to be successful in you learning some of these things. And I want you to ask me all the questions you want to. You can't do it all the time because I have other students, but I'm right here. And people get afraid. They say, oh, how can I have, relationships with 35 students? And I always respond, well, try not to have them, and you will see that all those students will have personalized behavior problems, and it's much more work for you than you recognizing their needs and somehow finding your way, not just one by one, but creating environments, classrooms, groups where students can feel belonging and thriving. Okay, that's a great transition to the next question, and I will actually just even stay with that and not go much further. The other part is students come back and want to have some voice. They've been independent. It's time for them to have a voice, and I want to just read you another page or two. This gets very much, student voice gets immediately into the whole issue of race and racism. The statistics of racial injustice regarding discipline continues to be depressing to this day. For example, a 2018 report by the US Government Accountability Office found that Black public school students were overrepresented in suspensions by 23 percentage points. These disparities are apparent even in preschool, where Black students account for 19% of all public preschool students, but represent 47% of student suspension. An important idea that was left out of these earlier papers and is still missing in policy debates is that schools, and I would say in general, also out of school time programs, should provide students a role in norm setting, discussing what the school community deems acceptable and what consequences are fair. If a school sees itself as a community, then everyone should be part of creating and refining norms. This does not mean that adults in authority positions cannot stipulate certain boundaries of unacceptable behaviors or apply district or legal parameters that are beyond the teachers or schools or after-school programs' control. But allowing students to have a stake in the norms they feel are important to them is very important for at least two reasons. First, if we want to strengthen our democracy, children and adolescents have to experience participatory rule setting, voting on significant issues, and protecting those who disagree. Democracy has to be learned and embraced in every generation. And participation in democratic systems is arguably more important now than in times past. And remember, I wrote this before the Capitol siege and the mob kind of racing to try to kind of kill people. Second, fairness and justice are typically best served when rulemaking and norm setting involve all members of the school or after school community. Importantly, traditional punishments are highly shaming and make individuals feel small and powerless, often leading to more escalation and a sense of not belonging. So these are just two examples. I can, there's a lot here on also rituals and mental health, all stuff I would love to have more time to talk to you. But I want to end with another quote. But what I'm trying to say here is when the students are home for a year and really look after themselves or have the parents look after them, but they have a lot of freedom, we can't just open the schools and say, hey, welcome, and here are our norms, and this is what we're doing, and shut up. No, that's not how it's going to work, and especially not for adolescents, and especially also not in your summer programs. You have to spend time not only to build relationships, but to create the system of fairness, of inclusion, and it's going to be, a lot of time. I know this. I mean, from staff meetings and others, you learn how to listen, and it's really hard, and people have other opinions than you do, but that's the process. We have to engage students in a new way, and those are two examples, and there are many other examples in the book where I think we had a problem before the pandemic, and now it's time to use the pandemic to actually change our attitudes, our structures, our curricula in very fundamental ways. And I will end with one quote here. We are now in a historic moment and need to bring about the changes that other crises have created in times past. Other times also required courage to innovate. But today we're living through a special type of crisis, not a war, but the end of a world order. That's how big I think the pandemic is. It's much more than just the coronavirus. Not starvation, but an illness that is ravaging communities around the country and the globe. Not revolution, but instability in the political system and rapid technological transformation. It is very possible that the implications of this period are going to be as consequential as the big and brutal crises that humans have encountered at other times. In the end, we'll find that these times of disequilibrium allow and even demand real innovation, empathy, and courage from all of us. Okay, now we have 10, 12 minutes for questions, discussions. Would love to kind of sit in the same room with you, of course, and have an open discussion, have more time to do this because I'm sure I kind of raised a lot of issues, but let's use the time.
So we do have a few questions that are in the Q&A box. Let's go ahead and read some of them. To what extent were various identities considered or brought in when considering what opportunities educators have to make change?
Okay. What identities meaning what kind of identities? Do we know?
I'm not sure. This was posted by an anonymous person. So maybe they mean different personalities.
Can you read it again? Yeah, can you read it again so I just can be sure that I respond as well as I can?
Yep. To what extent were various identities considered or brought in when considering what opportunities educators have to make change?
Okay, well, I think that kind of the internet connection defeated that purpose. Because I could only hear some part of it.
Maybe if whoever wrote that question could maybe add a little bit more into the Q&A box. We'll go on to the next one.
Okay, let's do that because I think it's a really important question. I just would like to know, are we talking about racial identities? Are we talking about rural versus urban? Are we talking about countries? I mean, I just need to know a bit more. Okay.
It is almost an age-old problem for US education, to the tug between politics and what we as educators know works. Can you reflect on the need for advocacy for students and youth in the political sphere for your 10 bets?
Yes, I love that question, because I have felt for a long time, with many other people in the out of school time space, that we create policies for youth and not with youth. And we don't even have policymakers who really understand young people. I mean, they all like think they do and they want to. It's not a matter of not wanting to, but I've been to many policy and advocacy kind of meetings over the years. And I just feel that most of the time, the young person drops out. And I don't think it's helpful to just have a conference with all adults and then you have one panel with youth, because it makes everyone feel a little awkward and uncomfortable. But I think the way in which young people, similar to the norm setting, before, let's say, a policy gets established in a district, there should be youth councils, student councils that deliberate. You don't have to give them the power that they can actually vote like the adults and change it. That would be great. But let's take a step at a time, but at least have the input of young people that say, we think this would work. No, we don't think this works. You're leaving this out. You're not leaving that out. Same with parents. It is essential to make that shift. You're not going to make the shift that I'm proposing here just based on voluntary teacher and after school provider kind of personalized learning approaches. You have to also make clear that that has to happen. And I think that also is important. I don't think all after school and summer programs really spend the time, because it's extra time, to test their plans for the summer with the students. It often happens that students have input like during the programs, but I think we just have to make that space, because once we do it, even from a totally functional level or almost manipulative level, the more you include young people's voices, the better the program will run. Because then you can also say, if it doesn't work, you say, well, yeah, it doesn't work so well, but remember we had those discussions together, and I guess we can all learn from this, rather than the students, critiquing what you're doing and then you feeling like, oh, we put so much work into it and it doesn't work. So you know what I mean? So that's where I think politics is a good place. Unfortunately, students are not voters. So it probably has to go through the parents in many cases, that the parents are very, very powerful constituencies. And if the parents listen to their children and the programs and schools support that, I think we will be at a different place than we are right now. Okay, let's go to the next question.
The next one says, I'm an educator in Houston, Texas, where I teach kindergarten. Some of my students are experiencing the school environment for the first time this year. No previous daycare or preschool interaction. They were catapulted into virtual learning. Some transitioned to an adapted in-person learning, 24/7 life in a pandemic, and most recently a traumatic winter storm and energy outage. I've struggled as an educator, and my students are struggling to understand their ever-changing world. So the question is, when do we decide as educators to accept natural performance rather than expected performance?
Well, I think I followed the question up until the last sentence, because I think that hello, Houston, by the way, one of my favorite cities, but I think that what you're describing is exactly the hardship that I am, writing about in the book. And we did some questionnaires and got some, feedback also from teachers. And it's tough. And the winter storm, and I didn't even connect that to the pandemic, but that's absolutely right. I mean, must have been extremely frightening. and dangerous. So how that then translate, and I think the other issue that you bring up is, students coming to school for the first time and potentially with this weird, like having to stay apart 6 feet and masks and all that. I mean, that's not over, even though your governor thinks, it is. I don't think that will go away right away. And so that's a really important issue. And I think it gets back to the relationship part. Many of these things can be overcome if the incoming students understand that you're right there with them, that you are concerned about their safety, that you will actually be there for them. That will create the foundation, similar to my little piece that I wrote about my elementary school teacher. He was present in a very special way. I think in the early stages of learning, maybe this idea that the distinction you make between expected content and learning and kind of more natural evolving content, I think that is easier to put into place. It's kind of also a Montessori type ideal, but I don't think that we can get away as a society without having norms and expectations. What I'm suggesting is let's have the students really participate in some of this, and just even have the students in kindergarten say, well, was this fun today? Did you enjoy it? I mean, just kind of take that feedback into the planning for the next day or the next week. But I do think that schools do have to mirror somehow the society's understanding of what it means to be an adult eventually, to function in the workforce. And I think that will always end up creating a need for schools to have some expectations. And I think the relational approach that I'm talking about, the radical relational approach, does have to also, be a way to push students towards excellence. That actually makes it possible. And that's okay as long as you don't push just because you're being pushed. It has to be somehow more authentic. Okay, we have time for a couple.
One more.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the best way to align the SEL approaches within summer learning with the SEL approaches in schools? And then do you have any examples of where communities have used that to change in school culture?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think the reason, and you will see that in the book if you read it. And in fact, I should, while we're talking, should put up the. Wait, I'm going in the wrong direction. Should put up the slide that shows you the book and how you can be in touch with me. And you will see, as Elaine saw this, that Gil Noam at harvard.edu, not an underline. You can get this book at Amazon with Amazon Unlimited, but also, I mean, we priced it kind of reasonably for $12 for a hard copy. Because I don't want people not to be able to use it and maybe even use it as groups. In terms of SEL, I think the big issue is, what is the unifier? The problem with SEL right now is that there are a lot of different skill sets, such as teamwork and empathy and self-management and these are kind of 20, 30 lists long, and every district, every school, even every classroom has different priorities. So because of that, we created this idea of a Clover model, a family of skills, and really through the literature review and our own research distilled 4 elements. So within those elements, let's say student voice, you have a lot of different opportunities. You can focus on the interest in perseverance. You can talk about debating. You can talk about communication. But the overall menu, it's like, you know, what you eat is simple. People are not saying you have to eat eggs necessarily, but they are saying that you have to eat certain foods or families of foods in order to have a balanced diet. So if you take that perspective, like the physical self, the agentic self, the relational self, and the kind of cognitive meaning-making self, then you can, I think, build the bridge and say, well, let's really see what we're doing here in the out of school time in the summer, and how are you picking up on some of these things during the school? And you will find immediately that schools are not very good at the body. In fact, in middle school, most schools really dislike the body because they're scared. They think of it as sexual and aggressive. So we have to get to a point where we depathologize certain things. And I think the after school, the summer, can actually help to figure out with schools that they're affiliated with how to bring that into play. And at the same time, schools can have a good way of influencing summer learning, how to actually entice the cognitive self, how to bring somehow the fun learning and align it with some of the things that students have to learn and have to be prepared for the next year. I don't know whether I'm answering the question, but I think that's the kind of co-design that I'm looking for. I know we have to stop. I just want to thank all of you for allowing me to test whether I can communicate, you know, the contents of the book, because obviously there's a lot to cover, but I've had fun and I hope to stay in touch, and please write me an email if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Noam, for sharing the new book with us. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of announcements.
Oh, you're trying, maybe wait, I'll stop sharing.
Nope. Got it.
Are you trying to share something, Leslie?
I think you should see it. You should be able to see it. Yeah.
So we can see.
Okay.
Look out for more announcements of our Voices of Summer webinar series. Our next webinar will be next Thursday at 1 p.m. We're going to be talking about the new American Rescue Plan and what this new stimulus means for summer and out of school time programs. And if you're not following us already on social media, this is the best place to see it. When we make new announcements, you can sign up for our newsletter or join special cohorts of peers interested in topics like sports, literacy, or youth employment. You can also find out about consulting and support technical assistance opportunities on our website. And Aaron, did you want to say anything?
No, just thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Gil, for an inspirational, informative, and motivational book that you've written for all of us right now that we could really take advantage and put into practice. So we're grateful and look forward to working with you and everyone who joined us on this call as we all prepare for this coming summer and beyond.
Thank you. Bye-bye.